party. Keeping the Tory party together in an uneasy truce cannot and must not be a more important consideration and aspiration for the UK government than the job prospects, living standards and opportunities for this and future generations. What the modelling in this paper that we are publishing today shows, beyond any doubt, is that if the economy, living standards and investment are our priorities, staying within the single market is absolutely essential to minimise the damage of leaving the EU. The analysis that we published today is more detailed and extensive than anything so far provided by the UK government, and that in itself speaks volumes about their reckless and irresponsible approach. This paper looks at the only three realistic outcomes of Brexit. These are, firstly, staying in the single market; second, concluding a free trade agreement similar to that between the EU and Canada; and third, reverting to World Trade Organization terms, the so-called no-deal option. Our modelling takes account of the impact on trade, productivity and migration of each of these possible future relationships. And let me be very clear. This analysis shows that none of these options are as good as staying within the European Union. Our economy will take a hit under all of them. However, the least damaging option by far is staying in the single market. Let me outline as briefly as possible, with apologies for the flurry of statistics that you are about now to receive, the key implications for our economy by 2030 of each of these options compared to what the situation would be if we stayed in the EU. Under the so-called no-deal option, a WTO-based relationship, our GDP will be 8.5% lower by 2030 than if we were to remain in the EU. That is equivalent to £12.7 billion, or £2,300 for every person in Scotland. Under this option, real disposable income would also be 9.6% lower and business investment 10.2% lower. Under the option of a free trade agreement, GDP would be just over 6% lower, equivalent to £9 billion or £1,600 for every single one of us in Scotland. Real disposable income would be over 7% lower and business investment lower by almost 8%. And staying in the single market compared to full EU membership would reduce GDP by 2.7%. That's equivalent to £4 billion or just under £700 per head of population. Under this option, real disposable income would be 1.4% lower and business investment lower by just under 3% than if we were to stay in the EU. So it's clear from these figures that staying in the single market does not insulate us from the costs of leaving the EU, but it will minimise those costs. Indeed, compared to a hard Brexit, staying in the single market will benefit us to the tune of £1,600 per head, £1,600 for every person in Scotland. Now, much of the Brexit debate so far has understandably focused on the prospects for trade. But within Scotland, we know that it is our need to grow our population and improve productivity that are most often cited in our current economic debates. Indeed, these factors featured prominently in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's recent growth forecasts published alongside our draft budget. So it is striking that when you read the detail of the analysis we publish today, that it shows that the economic hit we will take comes not just from a loss in trade, but actually more so, especially in the longer term, from losses in productivity and population, the very things we need to improve on if we are to boost growth, jobs and living standards. So the evidence we present today is clear. The best way to minimise the economic damage of Brexit is to stay inside the single market. It's also, in my view, the best way to safeguard workers' rights and the social, consumer and environmental protections that we have come to take for granted. Of course, so far I've talked about the benefits of staying in the single market as it is just now, but the single market is not yet complete. The paper also sets out the future opportunities of continued membership for services, energy and the digital economy in particular. It seems inconceivable that while 30 countries of the European Economic Area, those still to join, will enjoy the benefits of that growth while we will be left outside. Indeed, that is particularly frustrating a prospect because Scotland is very well placed to take advantage of the developing and deepening single market. Our world-class universities, our potential in renewable energy, life sciences, our digital sector and other key areas of the Scottish economy are all in prime position to reap the rewards of these developments. And that would mean more jobs and higher wages. So it would be a tragedy for future generations if we were to let that opportunity pass us by. In services, for example, where both Scotland and the UK as a whole have a comparative advantage, the long-term potential gain from completing the single market is estimated to be of the order of 2.4% of EU GDP. A boost of national income of that size in Scotland would be equivalent to £3.6 billion or almost £700 per person. Enhancements to the digital single market could mean a further increase in EU GDP of nearly 2%. And for Scotland, that would be equivalent to almost £3 billion or over £500 per person. So this paper sets out the positive case and the significant economic benefit for Scotland if we retain our place in the single market compared with all of the other Brexit options. And finally, before I hand over to Michael, the paper looks at the issue of migration, which I recognise is not always an easy subject for politicians. The paper briefly explains free movement in the EU context, what it does and does not mean, its restrictions as well as its entitlements. But more importantly, it sets out why our continued ability to attract EU nationals to live and work here is so essential to our future economic prosperity. Growing our population, particularly our working age population, is perhaps the greatest national challenge that we face. Over the past 15 years, EU migration has helped to turn around the long-term decline in Scotland's population and mitigate the impact of an ageing society. But we still face a big demographic challenge. Over the next 25 years, our own projected birth rate will not be sufficient to grow our population. In the period to 2041, all of our projected population growth will come from inward migration. Without that, our population could go into decline, and with it, our ability to grow our economy and fund our public services. So that would be the stark reality for Scotland of a restriction in our ability to attract people to our country. And that is why, as First Minister, I have a duty to make the case for free movement, no matter how difficult that is sometimes perceived to be. Of course, the opposition to free movement on the part of some people is often based on the view that migrants are somehow a burden, and that could not be further from the truth. The contribution of our fellow EU citizens is, of course, far more than just economic. Those who do us the honour of making Scotland their home make our country stronger in so many ways. But the economic benefits are clear, and this paper sets them out. For example, it finds that each EU citizen contributes, on average, £10,400 in tax revenues. That is tax revenue that helps fund our NHS and our other public services. So in short, free movement should not be a barrier to staying in the single market. On the contrary, our demographic challenge makes it all the more important that we do so. So in conclusion, this paper provides a far more comprehensive assessment of the different post-Brexit options than anything so far offered by the UK government. It demonstrates beyond doubt that if Brexit is to proceed, then staying in the single market is the only option that makes sense. Over the coming weeks and months, the Scottish Government stands ready to work with others to minimise the damage of Brexit. We will continue, as we have been doing, to reach out and engage with businesses, civic organisations, other political parties and government administrations, and with people across Scotland, the UK and the rest of Europe. The weight of evidence in favour of staying in the single market is compelling, and I believe that there is a majority there to be harnessed that can achieve at least that outcome. So I hope that the UK Government will now start to listen to this evidence. And with these comments, and before we take questions, I'll hand over to Mike Russell.
Thank you, First Minister. And as you have indicated, the reality of Brexit is now becoming increasingly clear. The challenges to Scotland's economy and society, which the Scottish Government set out in Scotland's Place in Europe in December 2016, are now coming into sharper relief. The prospect of a loss in income of as much as £2,300 per person in Scotland by 2030 as a result of a hard Brexit is a stark reminder, which should give every single one of us pause for thought. Now, in that context, it's clear that EU membership is still the best option for Scotland, and single market membership is the least worst option if Brexit goes ahead. It is sometimes hard to be positive in the face of the statistics that we're facing. But as well as this document demonstrating the scale of the impact Brexit will have on people and businesses, it also sets out a positive case. And firstly, it's a positive case for the single market, what it's already delivered for us, and the future opportunities that it continues to develop for us. And secondly, as the First Minister has said, it's a positive case for migration, determinedly going against the Brexiteers' refusal to acknowledge the vital impact and contribution of EU citizens in our society. The paper itself says that we seek to change the narrative on migration, ensuring a better understanding of its positive impact. And frankly, Scotland cannot do without it. Brexit, therefore, isn't about static and stale relationships, but it's about not being able to continue to participate in a dynamic and evolving market with a breadth of opportunities for people and businesses in Scotland. The EU has an exciting future. Scotland needs to be involved in that as closely as it can be. We were the first government in the UK to publish a serious paper on options for the future relationship with the EU short of continued membership, and to put forward proposals which still are regarded credibly. And this paper provides even more evidence to support our view, and in the interim the importance of the single market and customs union has been further underlined by a broad range of commentators and studies, some of which are referenced in this paper. Increasingly, it seems that those who advocate any other kind of relationships are actually at the extreme end of this debate, and their position is unsupported by the evidence. This paper comes at a very crucial time. Business is waiting with bated breath to see if a credible transition deal will emerge before March, or if business will need to activate now increasingly firm plans to move people and operations elsewhere in the EU. The UK government will soon embark on phase 2 of the negotiations, and the clock is ticking fast, with just 14 months until the UK leaves the EU and only 9 months until the ratification process for any deal would need to begin. The stakes have always been high, and they're getting higher every day. But it's also a critical time for our engagement with the UK government. We've welcomed the progress in phase 1 of the negotiations, difficult as that was. But the challenge of this in the face of what are significantly more difficult phase 2 negotiations is of real concern. Phase 1 actually isn't yet fully agreed, and yet there are much more significant challenges on the horizon. Now, in that context, we have to go on pressing the UK government to make real their commitment to the full engagement of the Scottish government and the other devolved nations in developing and agreeing the UK position. Now more than ever, as we move towards that phase 2, making use of and recognising all of the talent, ideas, priorities and evidence across all the nations will be critical. Now, the present impasse of negotiations on the withdrawal bill because of the failure of the UK to bring forward amendments as promised isn't helpful. It doesn't bode well for the future of these discussions, nor is being constantly let down by the UK government approach to intra-UK negotiations. But I want to stress that we stand ready as ever to enter into discussion on this paper. Indeed, I rang the Secretary of State for Scotland this morning to tell him what was in it. We're happy to take forward these key issues, to negotiate, to really negotiate and to discuss. We are still trying to find a compromise way forward, as we have been for the last 18 months. Unfortunately, time is running out for that.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. I'll take questions now. Brian Taylor.
You say being pragmatic here, but also sticking on that theme of pragmatism. What practical difference do you expect this paper to make in securing your objective of single market membership? How does it happen?
This paper is intended to influence this debate right now, and that is timely because the negotiations about the future relationship are about to start over the next few weeks. So now is the time to influence that debate. You know, I do believe that there is a majority to be harnessed in favour of single market membership. Jeremy Corbyn may be doing his best to obfuscate on that issue and pretend he doesn't understand this, but I think the pressure within the Labour Party may change that over the next period. If that happens, if Labour gets its act together, there are some, what I would describe as softer Brexit Tories who would, I think, favour single market membership. So we have made that case consistently as the best compromise option. Obviously, our preferred option is membership of the EU. But the reason to put this hard evidence of why that is the best or least damaging option into the public domain now is to seek to harness that majority, which I believe does exist if these conditions are met within the House of Commons, and we will continue to work hard to do exactly that. Colin.
So far, your detailed papers on Brexit have been either ignored or rejected by the UK government. You're going beyond the UK government now and appealing to MPs directly to try and block them. Is that what you're doing?
Well, I think the paper that we published last year, the evidence that we have continued to marshal, I mean, some of the evidence that is mentioned in this paper is evidence that other organisations have published over the past year. I think that has had an influence on public debate. If you wind the clock back a year, the voices in favour of single market membership were not as many or as loud as they are today. So I think the direction of travel is potentially, and I'm not overclaiming, is potentially now capable of harnessing that majority for single market membership. But I do think, to be absolutely candid, I do think one of the important things over these next crucial weeks and months is to hear the voices outside of the political and government processes. I and Mike will echo this point. I don't these days have a single conversation with business or with civic organisations where the concerns about Brexit, some of the concerns particularly around supply of labour for businesses, if we see a restriction on free movement, these are not top of the agenda. So these voices now have to come to the fore and be heard, and this paper is the first detailed evidence that sets out very clearly through the comparative analysis in it what the implications of the three broad realistic post-Brexit relationships are, and demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that the least damaging one is single market membership. So if jobs and living standards are the driver here rather than the internal politics of the Tory party, that's the direction we must go in. Jim. Well, look, the next phase of the negotiations will get underway in probably March. Everybody knows that they have to reach some kind of conclusion by the autumn of this year. So time is running out. That is why I said in my opening remarks that one of the things the UK government should not do as it goes into this next phase is repeat the mistakes they made in the first phase, where they spent months arguing over things that they then meekly accepted in order to get agreement. Let's encourage them to go into this next phase with realism at the fore from the start, and then perhaps we can see greater progress. James.
Thanks, First Minister. You spoke yesterday about a second independence referendum. Would you regard the two-year transition period as an opportunity, a time in which you could hold such a referendum?
Look, as you said, I repeated my position on a independence referendum and the timing and the process around that yesterday. I've got nothing further to say on that today that I didn't say yesterday. Today's paper is very firmly about trying to influence the debate across the UK right now as we head into this next phase of the negotiations. Sarah.
You say you're appealing to try and put together a majority in favour of your position, but Theresa May has been incredibly clear from the beginning that she believes the UK has to leave the single market. Do you really think you'll change her mind?
Well, I don't want to be facetious. I mean, who knows whether Theresa May will even be Prime Minister by the time these negotiations conclude. You know, there are voices within the Conservative Party that would argue for a softer Brexit and for single market membership. But, you know, put that to one side. There is, I believe, a majority outside of the Conservative Party. I think the bigger issue in order to get to that majority is to get Jeremy Corbyn off of the ridiculous position he is in. I mean, either Jeremy Corbyn is still misunderstanding the position of single market, which, given how often it has been pointed out to him, can't possibly be the case, or he is now trying to deliberately mislead people with this line that you cannot be in the single market if you're not being in the EU. I mean, Norway it stands as the living proof that that is just not the case. So the forces within, and we heard many of these voices again at the weekend, the forces within Labour in this direction are getting louder. So I believe that majority is there. And, you know, the House of Commons can, if it chooses to, decide not to allow Theresa May to go down the road that is in her narrow party political interest to go down, and instead force a path that is much more in the interests of the country overall. Peter.
First Minister, I see on page 16 there's a map.
Congratulations for having gotten to page 16 so quickly. Speed reading.
We didn't get very much time to read the whole document.
Oh, for goodness sake.
You say that trade with the EU is £12.3 billion. Now, trade with England, Wales and Northern Ireland is £49.8 billion. What would you say to your critics who say that perhaps you should be spending more time concentrating on improving trade across the border between Scotland and England than on your papers trying to influence the UK government?
Well, firstly, I'd say two things. I would say the characterisation of our position by my opponents is wrong, often knowingly and deliberately so. I do not want to compromise or give up trade between Scotland and the rest of the UK or these islands generally, and there is absolutely nothing that should make us say that that is necessary. I mean, you only have to listen to the UK government itself right now when it talks about Ireland, where it says very clearly to the Republic of Ireland that it can continue to trade freely with the UK, with the European Union, post-Brexit. So the UK government and our other opponents should simply stop saying things to Scotland that they don't say to Ireland. This is not an either or for Scotland. This is about making sure we continue to trade across the UK and the British Islands generally, build and strengthen that trade, which is an important point in both directions, because England trades a lot with Scotland as well as vice versa, but it is not a choice between that and trading within the single market with the rest of Europe. In terms of my focus, I will leave here later on to go to a roundtable discussion over lunch with a number of key people in the financial services sector. The Lord Mayor of London is visiting today. That is just one example of the work we do on an ongoing basis to strengthen the relationships and the trade across the England-Scotland border. And that is not compromised by what we're talking about here, and work to strengthen that will always continue. Right, I have a forest of hands. Yes, Catherine.
Hello. What if the UK, the rest of the UK, doesn't really have an appetite for staying in the single market despite all your efforts? What would you be doing to ensure, or as best you can, that Scotland has a differentiated solution for Scotland to remain in the single market if the rest of the UK does decide to leave the single market?
Well, we continue to put forward the proposals that were in our paper last December. These are all credible options, and I'll hand over to Mike in a second. He has many discussions on an ongoing basis about these options. But I don't accept that there is not an appetite necessarily across the UK for staying in the single market. So, let's talk about this in terms of ends and means. The end that we are seeking to secure for Scotland is, we would prefer to stay in the EU. Short of the EU, we want to make sure we protect Scotland's place in the single market because of the economic and social reasons for doing that. And along the way, we have contemplated another number of different ways in which we could try to secure that, keeping the UK in the single market as a whole, looking at different options for Scotland. And again, going back to the Irish situation, the UK government seems to think that differential arrangements for Northern Ireland are able to be contemplated. So to say that that is impossible for Scotland seems incredible. So we will continue to look at all different ways in which we can protect that endpoint for Scotland, which is so important to our economic prospects.
Let me just make the point that the issue of UK single market membership was not something that was fixed and immutable after the referendum. It took from the referendum in June 2016 to the Lancaster House speech in January 2017 before the Prime Minister made her mind up about single market membership and customs union membership. Just as indeed the Prime Minister and David Davis and others rejected transition all the way up to the Florence speech. So this has been a movable feast. Now, as the First Minister says, the last year's paper indicated, and this paper indicates, that the first preference is for the UK to stay in the single market. And the overwhelming body of evidence here is that that is a sensible thing to do. So rejection of that would in actual fact be the Prime Minister cutting off her nose to spite her face. That is a thing that will work for them. Only then, if that is absolutely rejected at the very last moment for a variety of internal Tory reasons, do the other issues come into play. And the issue of differentiation is now back in play. The UK government tried to knock it out last year after the publication of our paper with a very inadequate response that took, I think, 2.5 months, 3 months to make. Now, with the Irish situation, differentiation is what will take place. And once that is written down in legal language, and that is presently what is taking place in Brussels, it will be quite clear that differentiation is what operates. That's one of the issues that confuses the development of frameworks at the present moment, because we don't actually know the regulation is going to apply, but it looks as if there will be regulatory alignment between one part of the UK and the EU, that is between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And in those circumstances, differentiation for Scotland becomes a real option. But this paper is focused on the absolutely overwhelming evidence that continued single market membership is the least damaging option. And when you go beyond that into Canada with as many pluses as you put after it, or into WTO arrangements, then you're talking about even worse arrangements. So that's what we're focused on. But of course, there will remain a range of options. We'll continue to promote them and discuss them with key players.
Oh, the choice. Hamish.
First Minister, the success of your plans to stay within the UK to stay within the single market appears to rest on getting Jeremy Corbyn to change his mind. Have you held any discussions with the UK Labour leader? Are you intending to hold any discussions with the UK Labour leader to try and get him to change his mind?
Well, it doesn't rest on just getting Jeremy Corbyn to change his mind, or I would actually characterise it as to be coherent and logical rather than necessarily change his mind. It involves trying to help be part of a bigger consensus and coalition in favour of that. But, you know, clearly Labour's position is important. I haven't directly had discussions with Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, my colleagues at Westminster discuss these matters with the Labour group in the House of Commons on an ongoing basis, you know, including when the legislation is going through. But this is about building the biggest possible consensus behind what is not just, you know, the sort of preferred option for those of us who would prefer to stay in the EU, but as these figures demonstrate today, is absolutely, manifestly, beyond any doubt, the option that will do the least damage to our economy. And those who cannot see that, I think, are being blinded by perhaps ideological considerations rather than hard-headed ones. Yes?
The Fraser Vallender Institute has estimated that 80,000 people could lose their jobs within 10 years. Under a no-deal Brexit. Your analysis appears to be slightly more pessimistic about it. I wondered if you could put a figure on the number of jobs you might see being lost. It would be higher than 80,000.
This looks not specifically at the job numbers. The modelling looks at, as I've run through, GDP, real disposable income and investment, and is driven by a range of factors: productivity, migration. I think the job number, and you know, as you will see from the detail of this paper, the estimates that different organisations will do will differ in some respects in terms of their outcomes, but are all broadly in the same general ballpark. I think the jobs figures that the Fraser Vallender Institute have cited before are ones that I would say are broadly credible, and ones that I would have confidence in citing. Yes.
You indicated yesterday that you'll make a decision on an independence referendum in the final months of this year. Will you make a decision at the same time or before then on whether to support a second EU referendum?
I've got nothing to add to what I said yesterday on that particular issue. Yes?
First Minister, on migration, paper calls again for a separate Scottish system. In terms of policy in that area, are you minded to target overseas EU workers in the sectors that are needed in Scotland through, for example, a points-based system, or would you want the same open approach that we currently have?
I think the approach that we currently have is the preferable one. As this paper briefly sets out, you know, freedom of movement within the EU context is not without restrictions on people's ability to stay here beyond an initial 3-month period. So there are already restrictions and qualifications built into that. It's certainly the case, and many people argue that within the current treaty framework, the UK could choose to use some of the flexibility there to tighten those restrictions. So I think that broad framework is the right one. What this paper does, though, beyond any doubt, and I recognise that this is not always the easiest issue for politicians. People have concerns about migration. They cannot simply be dismissed. They have to be properly addressed. But what this paper sets out is why it is important to Scotland. And our demographic challenge is different to that across the rest of the UK. And when we have a situation where we know that over the next 25 years, all of the growth in our population is projected to come from inward migration, then to shrug our shoulders and say that it doesn't matter if we lose the ability to attract people from elsewhere in Europe is simply not an option, because that will have pretty stark realities for Scotland's economy and indeed for our budget and our spending power over the next number of years. So this is an attempt to continue, or a continued attempt to change the narrative around migration and to set out the facts and figures about why it's necessary for Scotland, but also the benefit that people who come here to live, work, contribute to our economy and society provide. The paper has figures on the total GDP contribution, the marginal contribution to our GDP that every additional EU migrant has, and the one I cited in opening remarks, the contribution in terms of tax revenue. So these are hard facts and figures. Glenn.
What if the UK does better than you expect in its negotiations and secures a Canada plus style free trade agreement, including services as well as goods?
Well, I think what this paper sets out is that there will be, well, two things. There is no option short of EU membership that is as good for our economy as being in the EU. But short of being in the EU, there is no option, even a Canada plus, if that was to prove to be possible, is not going to be as beneficial as being in the single market. So these are about degrees of what does the least damage to our economy. So I will continue to argue for single market if Brexit is proceeding. I hope the UK does well in these negotiations. I certainly hope it does better than everybody is anticipating. But we've seen the EU, and I make no judgment or comment on this, simply state it as a fact. We've seen the EU set out pretty clearly, and actually before Christmas pretty graphically, what the red lines of the UK government means in terms of the available options. And the red lines at the moment pretty much, you remember that graphic that Barney published, they pretty much rule out everything other than a Canada-style free trade agreement. So I hope we can get better than that, obviously, but I think it would be a big mistake if the UK does what it did at the start of phase one, which is just go in and argue for what is unachievable and fritter away time so that by the end of it you just have to accept anything that's on the table. Far better to go in with the sensible option from the outset, and that is single market membership.
That graphic is on page 7 of the report.
Thank you. Muir.
Your paper makes clear that you feel that staying in the EU is still the best option. You yourself have said that the possibility that the Brexit vote might be reversed has risen in recent months. And as you know, there's lots of people in British politics who still hope that Brexit could be stopped. Why aren't you focusing your attention on that rather than single market membership?
These are, when you are First Minister or a Minister in a government with the duty to protect the interests of the country in all circumstances, these are not either or situations. You have to look pragmatically and say, well, that may be my preferred option, and don't be in any doubt. Remaining within the EU for Scotland is my preferred option, and I still hope that that can be possible. But I also have to say, well, if that's not possible, what then is necessary to limit the damage that will be done to Scotland's economy? So this is a pragmatic view of looking at all options and trying to pursue, often in parallel, that's got to be done, but with the firm end in mind that it is about protecting Scotland's interests, and that's the approach that I will continue to take. Simon.
I just want to follow up on Peter's question with reference to paragraph 7, which says that Scotland's best interest will be served as being a member of the European Union as an independent state. I mean, what you seem to be saying is that basically an independent Scotland could join the EU but then have a different trading relationship with the UK as all the other 27 EU member states. How is that possible? Well,
presumably in exactly the same way as the UK is saying it is for the Republic of Ireland. I've got nothing to add to the fairly extensive answer I gave to Peter on that question. Any other hands? Yes.
Can you give us a sense of how severe a threat Brexit presents to the free shipping industry
Well, the fruit picking industry is one of many different sectors of our economy and particular industries that will be severely impacted. And I know Mike's had discussions with particular players in that sector about this. Now those impacts will come from the general implications of Brexit, but in that sector in particular, access to labour is a key consideration, and therefore the arguments and the points and the evidence that this paper includes on the migration free movement issues are particularly important. But it's one sector that I know has a high level of anxiety about Brexit, and we will continue to work with them as we do with the economy generally to try to make sure that we're mitigating as far as possible those impacts.
You might want to have a word with Lockie Porter and Angus Soft Fruits, who published figures last year that showed in last year he had a loss of over £600,000, which he attributed to Brexit, in terms of the narrowing of the season, the difficulties of getting workers at certain times, fruit not picked, and they anticipate that getting worse. I've met not just with that company, but with the sector as a whole, who've also met with the UK government and find the uncertainty to be the worst issue that they are addressing. They simply do not know what migration arrangements will apply. Some of the workers in that industry also work in fish processing at other parts of the year, and they're essentially resident. Others go home for a period of time, and there are other options for those workers, and that's a really important issue. There is a shortage of agriculture and horticultural labour right across Europe. Germany is taking people from the Ukraine who are special allocation in the last year. There are options for those workers which are better options now, both in terms of feeling more welcome and more secure, and also in terms of currency. As a result, people do not come. And that's replicated across a range of industries. I think in the next 12 months we're going to see in the hospitality industry particularly quite a tightening in that regard, and there's already representations being made. But it's also important to recognise that in terms of numbers and migration, EU migrants are essentially in a sort of horseshoe shape. You find them spread at all levels of the economy and in all areas. Of course, a preponderance at one end of low-skilled, but a very strong number of high-skilled workers in this very university. Speaking to Charlie Jeffrey, the Vice Principal, just this morning, 30% of research staff come from other EU countries. And that is right across the sector a real problem for university research, which is, of course, we have 5 of the world's top 2 universities in the world. We are a world beater in that regard. So there are issues in every area, and they can be illustrated now after 18 months of uncertainty by real impact, and that impact will accelerate.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, can I thank you all for attending?